Yes, here are a few items which we have on our fact file and our question and answer site, which is called Ask John Mackay. The issue of how different people groups ended up in different parts of the world has been something that's been constantly researched, and questions have been asked about it. And so we've got a few examples here about how the Aborigines ended up in Australia. And there's been some interesting research these days now that we can do all of these gene studies and look at which people groups are related to other people groups and how they may have ended up in the places they are. So let's have a look at a couple of these. The genome revolution has actually been an enormous help to the whole issue of biblical history and creation. So here is one study that was done back in 2009, which you can read the details of in the fact file, but it looked at mitochondrial DNA. So that's DNA not in the cell nucleus, but out in the cell components. It's studied a lot because it's a very small group of genes, and also you've got lots of copies of it. So there are lots of studies done on mitochondrial DNA. It's very useful. And there has been a long-running theory that Aboriginal people originally were related to people who live in India. So now that we can do these gene studies, several people, research groups have set out to look at this. And this was a study that was done with mitochondrial DNA, looking at what are called India's relic tribe. Now, India, of course, is a country with a very large population, and there are lots of what they call tribal groups who live out in the more rural areas rather than the city areas that we often see in the news. And here are their results. Our results showing a shared mitochondrial DNA, that's what the mtDNA, their lineage between Indians and Australian Aborigines provides direct genetic evidence of early colonization of Australia through South Asia. In other words, between India and Australia, of course, there are a whole lot of islands. And what they found is that there has to be a link between India and Australia, and the best way to get there is through South Asia. And this is a further study. Now, the interesting thing about that 2009 study is that in terms of the lifespan or the age of the when did this migration happen, they went for the long time ago, the 40,000 years that's in the news everywhere here and in the popular press. This was a further study looking at a number of different groups from the Northern Territory, from Papua New Guinea, which is the island that's just above Australia, and then people from the Philippines and some of those islands that are in between India and Australia, and also from other parts of the world. And what they found was that there was genetic mixing between India and Northern Australian populations. And because this was involved a lot more genes, they calculated how many generations ago this may have happened. And they came up with the answer of 141 and calculated 141 generations, right? And then relating that with various assumptions we must add as to how long each generation was. But they came up with an answer of how long ago did this happen? Well, 4,230. So that's a lot different to the sort of 40 to 65,000 years ago that gets thrown around in the popular press these days. Now, another interesting study that came up with a similar answer is not in people, but in dogs. Now, in Australia, we have dogs called dingoes. They are wild dogs, but they can breed with domestic dogs. And a lot of the farmers have, I know some people who actually had a dingo crossbreed. My friends came from central Queensland on the land there. And quite often the dingoes will breed with the farm dogs. So they can breed with the domestic dogs and produce fertile offspring. So there has been a bit of an argument as to whether we should classify dingoes as a separate species. But because they can breed with the domestic dogs and produce fertile offspring, they're very clearly the same species. And this was a study of the dog genes that was part of this debate that was going on as to how to classify the dingoes. And some scientists from the Australian Museum actually came up with this conclusion, that they were a feral population. Now, feral usually refers to animals that were domesticated and then have gone wild. So the dingoes were described as a feral population of an ancient breed of domestic dog that was brought to Australia by humans about 4,000 years ago. Now, as dogs are often associated with humans, maybe that's another clue as to how long the Aborigines have actually been here. So how would they get from India to Australia? There's an awful lot of ocean between India and Australia now, but we have to remember that the sea levels have changed in the past, and even the evolutionists who want the very long ages for the age of the Earth and the age of humanity will admit that in the past sea levels have been lower, especially associated with the Ice Age. So if you look at this map, which includes how deep the oceans are, those lighter areas around the islands and around the main continent of Australia, there are the continental shelves where the sea is a lot shallower. So that if the sea levels goes down, actually the size of Australia increases. It's already pretty big, but it increases by a significant amount. And a lot of those islands would have actually been joined up or separated by a lot smaller distances. So in times when the sea levels are lower, getting from India to Australia is not nearly as difficult as it is now if you were going by sea. And the idea that people lived and travelled over what is now the bottom of the sea is regularly confirmed when people trawl up various artefacts. This doesn't only happen in Australia, it certainly happens around Europe, in the North Sea and places like that. But this was a recent study that we wrote up in our fact file that you can look up. Hundreds of stone tools and grinding sites at 2 sites on the seabed near the Dampier Archipelago. So that's off Western Australia. They found lots and lots of these stone tools and artefacts, and we've got the reference to that original study if you'd like to go and look at it. But there's certainly evidence that people lived, travelled, and communicated on these areas which are now under the sea, but were exposed areas of land in times of those lower sea levels. And that brings up another question, of course, which we won't deal with now. What do they think caused the sea levels to change back there 4,500 years ago? It certainly wasn't from people driving cars or generating electricity, but that's another issue. Anyway, moving on, another evidence that's put forward about, well, the Aborigines have been here for 40 to 60,000 years is their art. And there are various examples of people trying to date the art. Now, this is some typical rock art of Aboriginals. This is the sort of thing that most of the tourists would know about of Aboriginal rock art. There's lots of examples of this all over the country. It does have different styles, just like European art and any other sort of art does have different styles. Now, there are some pieces of rock art that are clearly not 40,000 years ago. What do you think this looks like? How about something like that? Yes, now there's been exploration into Australia for the last few hundred years, but certainly not 4,000 years and certainly not 40,000 years into Australia. And so those particular pictures can't be that old. And one of our colleagues who's an artist, Steve Cardno, who does a lot of our artwork, being an artist, he knows a bit about paint. And he said, well, really, if the Aborigines could produce paint that lasted 40,000 years, the paint companies would be very keen to get their hands on it and would probably pay a lot of money for it. And which I thought was a very good comment. Something that I've actually observed myself, this was from Catherine Gorge, where there's a lot of rock art up in the Northern Territory. And I went for a trip up there and was taken on a tour by a local Aboriginal man and shown this rock art. And it was very interesting. And along the edges of some of these rock formations, there were these white lines of silicone. And he explained that those had been put there in order to divert the rain away from the rock art. Now, if they have to do that in order to preserve the rock art, and that's only been done in the last couple of decades, what was going on for so-called 40,000 years before modern people came along and put silicone strips there to divert the rain? And yet you can still see the examples of the art there. Perhaps John has some interesting insights into that later from what he's learnt from the Aboriginal people themselves. But there's more to this question than just how long have people been here and been in Australia. If we look at the content of the artwork itself, that tells you about what's important and significant in their culture. And one of the most common themes in rock art and Aboriginal art, even the modern Aboriginal art, but rock art all over the country, is the dominance of the serpent, and also in their stories. Very much the serpent is very dominant in their artworks, in their stories. And that says a lot about their culture and about our culture and about culture all over the world as well, because the serpent is a very common theme in lots of different cultures. And I think that tells us a lot about the biblical history of people. So
Diane was just talking about paint art and using Steve Cardno, who's our artist. And by the way, if you're a Christian, pray for him at the moment. He's up to his eyeballs in murals for our new museum, dinosaur growth rates and T-Rex patterns of growth, etc. And he needs it done by Thursday so we can get it up. But it's artwork. Okay, now here's a real story that actually relates to art, or several of them. Number one, I have personally visited many of these caves like Diane has, but mine are not the tourist ones. Mine are the ones that have essentially historic value, but the tribe has abandoned the cave because there's either nobody from that tribe left in the area anymore, or they just lost interest. Okay, so two aspects. Many years ago, I came across an old man who introduced me to local Aboriginal culture just over the border in New South Wales and told me about the Three Brothers. The Three Brothers story is all about how the Aborigines on Australia landed on the coast just down near Evans Head. Then they actually migrated west, north and south. And there are three mountains that remind us of these three brothers: Middle Mountain, or Middle Brother, South Brother, North Brother. But on the entrance to one of them, there's a cave. And there's faint paintings of the three brothers. So I went up there. No, we didn't desecrate them. The reality is they were so faint because the old man says, well, the young people don't come and touch them up every year, because if you have clay on walls or whatever, and it's going to be subject to the weather, to the wind and all of that, it does not last 40,000 years. And he basically said what used to happen is that every year at the growing up ceremony, the sort of circumcision event, enter into the tribe, they would come to this cave, and then they would actually have to take part in updating the colors, etc. So number one, any fresh looking paint on the Aborigines is not 40,000 years old. Now, that's the historic episode. Secondly, when you look at that story, the Aborigines landed just further south than where I was with the cave. But the funny thing is, even Captain Cook noticed they had no sea-going vessels. So hence Diane's questions. How did they get here? The water level was lower. They actually lived on the way. They took a little while. And Captain Cook worried, where did they come from? How did they get here? Because he had to have a big sea-going vessel. So when you look at the artwork in the Northern Territory, it pictures the Europeans arriving in their big multi-masted things, and the painting is very realistic. The traditional painting, dot style or X-ray style or anything like that, to you and me is not as realistic as their later paintings, which we can date from the 1600s onwards. But you see, when you get to northern New South Wales and you actually see the paintings that have been abandoned by the local tribes who have stories of a big flood, who have stories of arriving here after a big flood, who have stories of reaching the country after war and fighting in the middle of the world, and then going up into the hills and discovering the spirits, and then using that story to say, we used to have metal tools, but we lost the ability to make metal after they took up the spirits of the country. Okay, now a modern, up-to-date look at this from an Aboriginal. On the radio the other day, when I was asked to deal with this issue, because we have a big referendum coming in Australia on not just land rights or land wrongs, but on whether we need enhanced participation by Aboriginals who, in essence, most Europeans say you're giving them extra privileges that Europeans won't have. And we've got to decide whether we want to vote yes or no. More about that later. But this man came on the program. He was from a place called Ararat in Victoria. Yes, you've just guessed it. Obviously, Christian biblical influence. Obviously, a story of Noah's flood. Obviously, relating to where did all the people come from. But he was sharing how he was doing a job not far away. And there was a cave nearby. And the anthropologists had found this cave and they dated the paintings at 40,000 years. So obviously the Aborigines had arrived sometime before that. And those are the figures that are commonly tossed around, 40, 50, even 60 and 70, Diane. But he said there was an Aboriginal on the job with them, and the Aboriginal came up shaking his head and said, you know, boss, you white fellas are stupid. And they obviously got on well enough to insult each other. And he said, why? He said, them blokes down there that have dated that painting at 40,000 years, he said, me and my brother did those when we were kids. Right now, that's that's what they used to do, go and upgrade the paintings, but these were brand new. When that Aboriginal was a kid, they went into the cave and they put those paintings up. So in reality, if you've got questions about dating, about artwork, about how did the Aborigines get here, or what would make the sea level go lower? Is there any biblical reason? Now is the time to actually get. Oh, and I need to let you in on a secret. We'll give you a bit of reasoning later. And Joe will come on just before we have the next section with a slab from the Middle East, which actually relates to Australia as well, and how you decide who owns land. So when you have a look at this whole issue, do we have a biblical framework for the water going lower? Would it match the dingo DNA? Would it match the Aboriginal DNA? I guess I better tell you one last thing. I met an older Aboriginal gentleman. He'd been employed by the government. He was sort of like a counsel to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, and they travelled to India one year. And he went there just to, be an associate with the minister. And he said the local people kept assuming I was Indian. And he said, I just looked like the Indians. So they came up and they would talk to me in their Indian language, not in European English. And he, of course, only knew Aboriginal or English, so he didn't know what they were talking about. But the natives themselves assumed his looks were Indian, which, of course, matches the actual DNA evidence from, well, it was actually a group of Indians who did that first study, wasn't it, on the DNA. And you might want to ask Diane if you actually know what DNA they were actually looking for, because that's interesting in itself.